What's up guys, Cameron here from Drums and Drams, and today we've got another Scotch Sunday whiskey review, this time focusing on the drink of choice of one Mr. Ron Swanson from Parks and Rec. Of course, I am talking about Lagavulin 16 year, a sort of gateway single malt whiskey for those of you who are into all things smoke. This is coming to us from Islay, so if you know Laphroaig, you know Ardbeg, you definitely know what I'm talking about in terms of that peaty, smoky quality, although a lot of these Islay distilleries have their own unique characteristics with how that smokiness comes off. Across the industry, I would say that Lagavulin 16 is sort of a staple bottle. It's up there with the Macallan 12s, hate it or love it. It's up there with some of the Balvenis, maybe the 12-year Doublewood, and just some of these other standard bottlings that people come to know not only as whiskey enthusiasts, but also just as people who are kind of dipping their toe in, maybe just the general public. They've seen these bottles, and of course Parks and Rec helped the kind of visibility of Lagavulin as well. This bottle, like all others, has seen price increases in recent years. I've seen it float around between $80 to $110 here in Ohio. It kind of fluctuates, but at the end of the day, we should consider the fact that while we are presumably getting something that's chill filtered, that has color added to it, and is bottled only at 43% ABV, we are still getting a 16-year age statement. So with that said, we're gonna get into this thing here. We're gonna nose it, taste it. I'll give you some tasting notes, talk about how this thing is coming off on the palate, try to dig beneath the smoke, which is always the challenge of dealing with heavily peated whiskeys. And one last thing before we get into it, I have this sample here, which is going to be the next review on the channel, the next Scotch review, I should say. And this is a Lagavulin 21 year distilled in 1985. And I'm gonna tell you what, this is a very special bottle. It goes for about $5,000 plus at this point. It is a kind of cult following type bottle. Like this has a very specific audience. People rave about this thing, and it was sent in by Roy N., who's a generous supporter of the channel, patron, friend over the last couple years. And Roy has patiently, and I mean patiently, been waiting on me to review this 1985 Lagavulin. And the reason I'm tasting the standard 16 year this week is because next week, this is the review. I'm gonna film it right after I film this one so that I'm fresh in Lagavulin mode to get into it, and I cannot freaking wait. So stay tuned next week for this review, but now on the nose, Lagavulin 16 year, here we go. So first and foremost, we have to call out the elephant in the room, the smokiness on here. To me, this Lagavulin peatiness kind of comes off as a combination of campfire ash after you put out the campfire, and it also comes off a little bit as like a cigarette ash. So somewhere between those two things is how I kind of think about the smokiness coming from Lagavulin. But whereas Laphroaig feels more medicinal, more iodine, Band-Aid, kind of industrial, and Ardbeg tends, for me at least, to be a little bit more of like this pineapple tropical fruit that goes along with this almost smoky bacon kind of note. The Lagavulin comes off more as this kind of earthy, natural smoke. So I talked about the cigarette ash and the campfire ash, but also this earthiness to go along with those smoke notes. That to me is what defines Lagavulin 16. It's how I can recognize it in blind flights with some of those other heavily peated Scotch whiskeys. And I think as a general profile, feels more like brawny, than maybe Ardbeg or Laphroaig, which have a little more of a point to them. They're very pointed in what they are. Lagavulin feels more broad and brawny, and maybe that's a weird way to describe this whiskey, but it's the best I can do in this case. And to kind of go along with that earthiness that I was talking about, there is definitely a seaweed, almost kind of mossy algae kind of note going on in here. And there is a nice backbone to the whiskey as well, which is just a general toffee, general caramel toffee kind of note that you expect in a lot of Scotches. There is that backbone in this Lagavulin 16. So as you start getting beneath the initial smoke punch, the earthiness rises up, the seaweed, the mossiness, and then underneath all of that, I'm starting to find this, I call it a general note because it's predictable in some sense. many scotches have this toffee note, but to find it in the Lagavulin is more of the challenge because you have to dig beneath so many layers. And last but not least, I'm gonna call out a couple additional notes here. One of those is gonna be kind of a sea spray, sea air, salinity in particular, so I'm getting this saltiness on the nose. And I'm also finding that there is a fruit element in the whiskey. It's kind of hard to define. With everything else going on, I'm sensing some kind of like possible red fruit note going on, but I can't quite pin it down. So instead of continuing to try, I'm gonna get this thing on the palate now. Cheers. So this takes a long time to develop on the palate. That initial punch to me is sharp, it's aggressive, and it fades away fairly quickly before it has this secondary ramp up. And as it does start to ramp up into the mid palate, it starts to develop. That's truly when this whiskey blossoms. The unfortunate part is you kind of have to go through this initial punch that doesn't really coincide with much else. It sets the stage, it's very intense, it's a dramatic whiskey at the beginning. It goes away, and then it just swoops back in. And once it does, it takes a very long time to develop after the fact. The finish goes on and on and on, and I love that about it, but I think this thing suffers initially at the front of the palate where more cohesion, more of a transition from front to mid palate would help this thing out just in terms of drinking experience. But first sip, all in all, fantastic stuff, a lot of waves of flavor and a solid development after that first punch. Let's go back in now. Front of the palate, big smoky punch, of course. Smoky, earthy punch up front is what I'm getting. As it starts to roll back, it immediately transitions into a sweet and sour mid palate. So what I'm getting there is kind of like that toffee note that I talked about, the base of the whiskey, but I'm also getting some sour fruit elements as well. This is maybe a combination of some sort of ginger slash maybe some kind of tropical fruits in the mid palate, but it has this sour element that coincides also with that toffee note in the mid palate. And then as it starts to really roll back into the finish, it turns dry, which, you know, take it or leave it. It turns a little bit bitter as well. I'm getting not only the salinity in the finish, so that's helping with that dryness, that sea air kind of note, but I'm also kind of getting this combination of char, and I'm not confusing this with the smoky peaty note, but a distinct barrel char slash almost kind of like a coffee note on the back end. So when you have those kind of darker, more bitter notes, plus the salinity as well, playing into the finish, all of that's going to suck the moisture out, and it does feel like it's a little bit of a dry whiskey on the finish. When you think about a heavily peated scotch like this, I mean, you're expecting intensity, and to some degree, I think you do expect some dryness on the finish. So I wouldn't fault it for that. I mean, look, this is a classic scotch, and for some of the imperfections that it has, the purpose that this really serves for me is to either be somebody's daily drinker if they are a big peat head, they're a big Islay whiskey drinker, or it serves to be a gateway drug for somebody to get into Islay Scotch or maybe Scotch more generally. And I think no matter who you are in that lineup, it's going to achieve that goal. If you hate it, you hate it. And that's the end of the story. It's not gonna be a whiskey enthusiast's favorite dram, I wouldn't imagine. I think you're probably gonna be looking around for variations on this or more sophisticated blends or older age statements, maybe even younger age statements when you talk about some of the Lagavulins, but it's going to serve the purpose that it's intended to serve. And for that, I will always have a place in my heart for Lagavulin 16. I think it is a great scotch, and it's not for the faint of heart, but if you are trying to either venture into scotch more generally and you want to dive off the deep end, or if you're somebody coming from the land of Glenlivet, Glenmorangie, Glengrant, insert, very approachable sweet scotch here, and you want to try to get into some of the smokier stuff, if you're going to go whole hog, this might be the way to do it. But let's do one more sip and then we're going to wrap this video up. The last thing I'm gonna say about this is that this whiskey is one that deserves your time. And what I mean by that is if I hadn't taken 3, 4, 5 sips of this, I would never know that on this last sip, there's like a really strong vanilla note going on in the glass that I could have never experienced at the very beginning because the smoke is hitting me so strongly and there's all this earthiness that I have to get past. And so for this whiskey to kind of reveal itself to you, I think you need to spend quality time with it. I know that sounds kind of cheesy, but that's part of the beauty of whiskey. Cigars as well, which I'm not into, but I hear people talk about in the same terms. It forces you to slow down. It forces you to spend time with something and think about it and, you know, kind of get lost in your thoughts. And I think the Lagavulin 16 is great for that because it has so many layers to peel back, even though it is one of those 43%ers from Diageo that's colored and chill filtered, and that sucks. It makes up for that in some sense because of the profile, because of how this thing, you know, kind of operates more generally in the market as a gateway bottle, as, you know, a bottle to get people into Islay Scotch. For those reasons, I think it deserves time. But on the flip side of things, I would also say that if you go to a bar, like personally, I find myself drinking a lot of peated Scotch at bars because it cuts through the noise. So not only can you spend alone time in a quiet place with this to really dig in, but if you want something to keep your attention at a bar and not fade into the background, this is also a great choice for that as well. So given the price point, I think it's a fair value kind of bottle, but it's one that I think every Scotch whiskey enthusiast, lover, or even newbie or novice should check out. If you don't like Islay whiskey, totally get it. Smoky is kind of hard to get into. I had a really hard time with it, and then all of a sudden I fall in love with Laphroaig, and here we are. I love Lagavulin as well. So let me know what you think in the comments. Hit that like button if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe to the channel. Thank you for tuning in, and come back next week for this Lagavulin 1985 21 year. I cannot wait to taste this, and I'm gonna taste it in just a few minutes, but you're gonna have to wait a week. Cheers, guys. I'll see you next time here on Drums and Drams.